So we looked a bit on how the concept of deep history could help us to understand some aspects of where we are in the history of humanity at the moment. So we shall now have a look at what deep sociology can teach us. And we will look at two things there. We'll look at cultural transformation and the concept of collective imaginaries. So just to understand a bit the concept of sociology and where sociologist comes from, this is a good sociological insight that if a factory is torn down, but the rationality which produced it is left standing, then that rationality will simply produce another factory. And sociology is all about understanding the deeper structures of society and culture, and how many ways these deeper structures of society and culture are holding us humans in a grip that we are not really aware of, and becoming self-aware of that grip, but also the possibility that we have to reconstruct and reimagine these deeper structures of society is very helpful and gives us hope that it is possible to transform society also at a deeper level. But first of all, we need to understand what these deeper levels are really about. So let's go back to our systems perspective and looking at self-organizing adaptive systems. And we said that the cultural evolution is the latest level of evolutionary development, and that it's moving relatively fast. So if we look at this phenomenon of human culture and human society at a deeper level, we humans have an ability that is unique amongst all animals, and that is the ability to, through our language, through our symbolic language, create a symbolic universe, a symbolic world that is somehow independent of the individuals in society and is replicated and perpetuated by all the individuals in society, one generation after the other. And this evolution of this symbolic world has been going on from the very, very early stages of humanity. Here we can see some cave paintings from 70,000 years ago. And we humans have probably had this capacity for symbolic language and culture building from at least 100,000 years, perhaps 200,000 years, perhaps even a bit longer. And when we look at these different symbolic universes that we humans have created throughout human history, it is much easier to see the existence of these symbolic universes, these cultures, when we look at cultures that are very different from ourselves. It's obvious when we see a picture like this that these humans are in a belief system or in a symbolic universe that gives them meaning and gives structure to that society that is very difficult for us coming from the outside to see and to understand. But we humans, we tend to take our symbolic universes, the fundamentals of our culture, as something given, as something natural. It's a little bit like the water that the fish is swimming in. It's difficult for the fish to see the water. But this symbolic universe has continued to evolve, and we have built more and more refined systems of understanding and imagination. And these systems of beliefs and institutions and customs have been evolving all the time. And today we are still living in these evolving cultural symbolic systems. It's just that today we don't tend to see our symbolic world in that way. We are sort of taking this symbolic world that we have invented more or less for granted. But our modern symbolic world is not different in kind from the symbolic world of humans 1,000 or 5,000 or 50,000 years ago. And these symbolic worlds that we invent and then live in, and we invent them, but then when we live in them, they shape us. Sociologists call that our collectively constructed social imaginaries, or our collectively constructed collective imaginaries. And the name sort of indicates that this is something that is not just individual to a specific individual, but it's actually something that we co-create and co-replicate collectively. And therefore, we as individuals, to a very large extent, just have to adapt to these collective imaginaries and internalize them and be socialized into these collective imaginaries. But collectively, we have power over them. And this is quite abstract, so I would want to take a more concrete example to explain what this is about. And one way of doing this is to look at two different phenomena. We can look at nature and perhaps more specific oxygen, and we can look at the market, and we can look at money. And for me as an individual living in the modern world, my need for oxygen, for clean air, for air to breathe, and for money can seem equally important. Without oxygen, I will die, and without money, I will not be able to sustain myself. So, as an individual, I have to just accept the fact that I'm dependent on oxygen, and I just have to accept the fact that I'm dependent on money. But if we look at us as a collective, then even if the whole of humanity came together and decided unanimously that we as humans do not want to be dependent on clean air and oxygen any longer, we could do nothing about it. So even as a collective, we have to accept the fact that we are dependent on oxygen. But if the whole of humanity, or even just a majority in a nation state, would come together and decide that we do not want to be dependent on the money any longer, then money could be gone tomorrow. Of course, we might want to invent some other system or structure or symbolic universe that helps us to allocate resources and services in society. but money could be gone. So collectively, we are free to change. And that is the difference sort of between the most fundamental aspects of our natural world and our socially constructed world. Everything in the world that is socially constructed, and that's 95% of our human world, we are actually free to change, not as individuals, but as collective. And again, if I will, as an individual, would, when I'm come to the cashier in the supermarket, tell the cashier that when he or she is asking me for money, telling him or her that, well, you know, money is just a social construct, so I can't see why I need to pay. Then the whole system of society will help enforce this collective imaginary of money, and I would be picked up by the police. And if I would be even more insistent on not following the collective imaginary, I would perhaps, as Michael Foucault and other sociologists have pointed out, I might be called insane and put in a hospital or be medicated to be back into the social reality, into the socially constructed collective imaginary. There are so many forces in society sort of reinforcing the collective imaginary that I, as an individual, I just need to accept that reality. But again, collectively, we are free to change it. What is sad is that these aspects are often mixed up. So sometimes it seems to me like we believe that the planetary boundaries, that they are up for negotiations, whereas the market forces we just have to accept, when of course it is the opposite. We humans cannot negotiate with the planetary boundaries, but the market forces is under our collective control. But of course, if we are to change our collective imaginary, we need to do that again collectively. And in order to do that, we need to take collective action. And for that, we need collective sense-making. And sadly, I think that during the last 10, 20, 30 years, we have, just as humanity, become worse and worse when it comes to collective sense-making. And therefore, our ability to make crucial collective decisions in, for example, these areas, have to a very, very large extent diminished, which means that we as humanity are leaving a lot of human freedom and possibilities on the table, so to say, unable to exercise this sort of freedom. Just to show that when we do exercise collective choice making, then we can change our collective imaginary. And one example we have here in Sweden, of course, which is when we in 1967, in September 1967, collectively decided to stop driving on the left-hand side of the road and to start driving on the right-hand side of the road. And that's a good example, because even if I, as an individual, would have thought that it would be a better idea to drive on the right-hand side of the road, which it actually was, because back then in Sweden, all cars still had the wheel on the left-hand side. So driving on the left-hand side really made it very difficult to overtake, because you more or less needed to bring all the car out to the other side of the road before you could see if the road was clear. But if I myself would have taken the decision, tomorrow I will, as a good example, start driving on the right-hand side of the road, of course I would just have been killed or injured or taken by the police. We cannot take individual initiatives and just start living as if the collective imaginary was different. But again, when we had this collective decision, we had this night in September in '67, when at 5 o'clock in the morning, all cars were moving over to the other side of the road, and then 5 minutes later started to drive on the other side of the road. And there were actually no fatal accidents in Sweden or anything serious happened. And we had overnight changed the collective imaginary. A collective imaginary, by the way, that was very much created just by chance. And that is often the case, that there is not, in many cases, a lot of thinking around creating collective imaginaries from the start, and they just get stuck. So when the original decision to introduce left-hand driving or riding, as it was back then, was actually taken, some historians say, because most people were right-handed and needed to use the right hand to defend themselves, and carrying the sword on the left-hand side. So it made much more sense to be meeting people on that side rather than this side. So for whatever reason, can be just a random reason, and then 100 years later, it becomes super difficult to change the social imaginary. And again, it's the same. And with the market, for example, the way that we are using property rights and the way that we are using corporations and all of these things, nobody has really designed this. It has just emerged as the social imaginary. And it could be different, and having a different social imaginary in that respect could have a very, very different outcome on both justice amongst people and the preservation of the planet. Again, looking deeper into society, it's important to understand that what we usually see is just a very, very small part of our society and our collective imaginary. We are just seeing a very little bit that is visible, and underneath the surface, we have mental models and habits, and even deeper in society, in the unconscious parts of societies, we have the perspectives and understandings that underpin many of our choices, like things like the view of ourselves, the view of the world, our view of consciousness, our view of society, and the view of our lives. And they are very, very much informed about the collective, from the collective imaginary. And it is very difficult in a society to hold views that are very much deviating from the norms in society when it comes to these issues. So for a society to change these unconscious structures, it really becomes a collective exercise to do that. As it's difficult to really see that deep in society, and as this transition that we are in right now is very much covered in fog, it's important to understand that we all have very different perspectives when we come to try to understand what is going on and what is emerging. And to really try to get a more multi-perspectival picture of what is going on, we need to approach this time in humanity from many different perspectives. And it's a little bit like these 7 blind persons checking out the elephant. We all hold a little bit, a part of the truth, but it's really when we are coming together and trying to bring our different perspectives together that we can start to understand what is emerging. And one initiative that I've been involved with is the initiative of Emerge. And if you want, you can go to the URL whatisemerging.com and to see some of the perspectives that are developed there on what is actually going on in the world right now. So that was the concept of the collective imaginary. I also want to talk a little bit about cultural transformation and trying to understand how culture evolves, and doing this now from a more empirical point of view. So there has in the world for the last almost 50 years been a huge international academic study called the World Values Studies, which involves academics in more than 100 countries, every 4 or 5 years, doing deep interviews and trying to assess the value space and the way that culture evolves in the world. And it's a rich study, and you can slice and dice the material in many different ways. But one way of doing it that is quite popular, and perhaps some of you have already seen this diagram. It's a diagram where you are plotting the sort of the survival and self-expression values against the x-axis, and the traditional versus secular rational values on the other axis. And one interesting thing here, worth noticing, is that all the Scandinavian countries have a very extreme position in this graph. We are very much concentrating on self-expression and trying to find our own individual path in life. And at the same time, we have very little support from traditional values and traditional society, and living in a very secular and rationalistic world. And some people point out that this is a position also of it's a position of extreme individual freedom, but it's also a position of extreme anxiety. Anyhow, one can see that over time in our world today, in our modern world today, and it's important to stress that this is in our modern paradigm, then most cultures are moving up to this corner, this Scandinavian corner. And then it would be very easy to think that this corner is sort of the end of history, and that this is where most culture will end up. But that is a very deep mistake to do that, because first of all, cultural transformation, cultural development is not linear in any way. And then you need to take into account the paradigm shifts. And if we put the paradigm shifts on top of this graph and shrink this graph into this space, if this is the modern space, then you can say that modernity, the value space of the modern world, is in this rectangle. But then going back just a couple of 100 years ago, in the pre-modern world, then all cultures, including the Scandinavian cultures, of course, were all in this pre-modern space, which was dominated by survival values on the individual value scale and the religious dogmatic worldview on the worldview scale. And then something happened. And even if I put an arrow here, again, this is not a linear development. You go through the paradigm shift, you have all the turbulence and everything, but you can break out of one's value space and you go into another value space. And this is the value space of modernity that is dominated by self-expression again and the secular rationalistic worldview. So the interesting question today, when we are looking at what might come out of this turbulent transition that we are in right now. So again, it's not a linear development. It will be a very, very messy transition. A completely new space is opening up. And then all of a sudden, countries like the Scandinavian countries who felt quite secure and developed in the modern sense of looking at the world, we might be completely lost in the next step, and other cultures might be the ones that are sort of more easily adopting themselves into this new space, which we don't know what it will be, but we could still, from this diagram, infer that perhaps on the personal value space, we will be moving from self-expression and sort of building our own ego in the ego project to self-transcendence, where our own individual projects might not be at the center of our lives any longer, but something bigger than ourselves might be of equal or even greater importance. And then on the worldview axis, we are moving perhaps from a secular worldview to some more holistic worldview. And when we're talking about holistic worldviews, some people are taking the example of the indigenous worldviews that are often very, very much more holistic, meaning taking into more perspectives into consideration. So might we find inspiration from both indigenous cultures and from more traditional religious cultures and secular cultures when it comes to a more holistic, more encompassing worldview in the future? And might it be in this value space up here where we actually find this third attractor that we were looking for before, when we were looking at the bifurcation point and the different breakdown scenarios and breakthrough scenarios? To talk a little bit more about this possible of a new third attractor, a positive breakthrough to a new civilization, it can make sense to use again the worldviews and the names of the pre-modern and the modern. And we haven't yet spoken about it, but of course, during the last 50 years in the West, there has been the evolution of a new worldview that is very much criticizing and deconstructing our modernistic worldview, showing the limitations of our modernistic, rationalistic, scientific worldview. And that is, of course, the postmodern philosophy and the worldview associated with the postmodern philosophical way of seeing the world. And it's important to understand that the postmodern critique is in many ways very valid and very necessary, a very necessary correction of the excesses of the modernistic worldview and its very singular emphasis on science and rationality. And the postmodern worldview also has helped us to see hidden power structures in society, bringing gender perspectives, bringing post-colonial perspectives into our understanding of the world. And not the least, what we just were talking about, starting to understand that a large part, almost the majority of our human worlds, are socially constructed. That is also a very important postmodern insight. But at the same time, the postmodern way of looking at the world is very good at deconstructing the world, in critiquing the world. But it usually ends up in a quite value relativistic space and cannot really point a way forward. And any direction, any directionality, any value hierarchies, and even meta-narratives, grand stories around the world, stories like the one I'm telling right now, are not accepted by postmodern thinkers. And that is, of course, correct in some ways, because we have so far very much both in religion and in society taken these meta stories about ourselves, our grand narratives, as something that has been given from the outside. In religions, we take the meta narratives as given by God, and in modernity, we took also science as given by nature. But through the postmodern insights, we understand that all meta-narratives are human constructs. But the immediate postmodern insight from that is usually, as all narratives are human constructs, they are arbitrary and worthless. Whereas I think that we need to move beyond that and start to realize that we humans, we need our narratives and we need our value systems, but we have to understand that they have always and will always be human constructs, and that we humans needed to become self-aware and become active co-creators of those aspects of our world.